When most people hear the word wetland, they imagine a swampy patch of ground that sits somewhere between useful land and open water. But that in-between status is exactly why wetlands matter so much. A wetland is a semi-aquatic ecosystem where the ground is flooded or waterlogged long enough to reshape how life works from the soil up. Some wetlands stay wet year-round for decades, while others flood seasonally and dry down later. Either way, the repeating presence of water creates conditions that are very different from forests, grasslands, rivers, or lakes. Wetlands are transition zones, and transition zones are where ecological processes often become most intense. Here, water, sediment, nutrients, plants, and microbes are constantly exchanging matter and energy. That movement creates biological productivity, habitat complexity, and chemical filtering functions that many other ecosystems cannot match at the same scale. So wetlands are not failed dry land and not shallow leftovers of lakes. They are their own category, with their own rules, and those rules affect everything from fish nurseries to flood safety in nearby towns. The core mechanism begins underground, in oxygen-poor soils. In typical dry soils, oxygen diffuses through pore spaces and supports aerobic decomposition. In wetland soils, standing water blocks that oxygen exchange, so decomposition shifts toward anaerobic processes. This change sounds technical, but it has huge consequences. Nutrients cycle differently, organic matter breaks down more slowly, and specific microbes dominate that would not survive in oxygen-rich ground. Plant roots also face a major challenge. They must survive in waterlogged substrate that can suffocate ordinary terrestrial plants. Wetland vegetation evolves special adaptations, such as air channels in stems and roots that transport oxygen downward, shallow root systems that exploit upper layers, or salt tolerance in coastal settings. These adaptations are not decorative traits, they define which species can establish and persist. The result is a landscape where biology and chemistry are tightly linked. Hydrology sets soil oxygen shapes microbes, microbes influence nutrient transformations, and nutrient availability drives plant communities. That is why even small changes in flooding duration or depth can reorganize a wetland's ecology. Because wetlands exist under many climate and water conditions, they are classified by vegetation and water source. Marshes are typically dominated by herbaceous plants like reeds, cattails, and sedges. Swamps are usually dominated by woody vegetation such as trees and shrubs, although regional exceptions exist, including reed-dominated systems called swamps in some European contexts. Mangrove wetlands are different again. They are woody coastal systems built by salt-tolerant species adapted to brackish or marine influence. The classification matters because each type supports different food webs, different shoreline functions, and different carbon dynamics. A marsh may excel at filtering nutrient-rich runoff and providing bird habitat. A forested swamp may store large organic soil reserves and support amphibians, reptiles, and mammals in structurally complex habitats. Mangroves can act as coastal wave buffers while supporting fisheries and trapping sediment. When people use one word, wetland, as if it described one uniform thing, they miss this diversity. Management decisions that help one wetland type may damage another if the hydrology, salinity, and vegetation context are misunderstood. Water source is another key lens. Tidal wetlands are shaped by ocean pulses, estuaries by mixed river and tidal waters, floodplains by overbank river flow, and bogs or vernal ponds by rainfall, snowmelt, or groundwater mediation. These water regimes control salinity, nutrient loading, sediment movement, and flood timing. In estuaries, for example, freshwater and saltwater mixing creates gradients that support highly productive nursery habitats for fish and invertebrates. In floodplains, periodic inundation reconnects rivers with adjacent soils, spreading sediment and nutrients while dissipating flood energy over wider terrain. In bog-like systems, lower nutrient inputs and hydrologic isolation can produce slower decomposition and unique plant communities. Think of hydrology as the operating system and vegetation as the visible interface. If you alter the operating system by levees, drainage channels, excessive groundwater extraction, or blocked tidal exchange, the entire ecological interface begins to shift. Species composition changes first, then nutrient behavior, then habitat function, and eventually the social benefits people depend on begin to erode as well. Wetlands are global, found on every continent except Antarctica, and they appear in freshwater, brackish, and saltwater forms. At planetary scale, some of the largest wetland systems include the Amazon Basin, the West Siberian Plain, the Pantanal, and the Sundarbans Delta region. These are not minor ecological pockets. They are continental-scale regulators of biodiversity, hydrology, and biogeochemical cycling. Large wetlands shape regional rainfall feedbacks, influence sediment pathways, and provide migration and breeding grounds for massive numbers of species. But the global map also teaches a second lesson: wetlands are context-dependent. A tropical floodplain and a temperate peat-rich wetland may both be called wetlands, yet their seasonal pulses, dominant species, and greenhouse gas behavior can differ dramatically. This means conservation cannot rely on one universal template. Effective protection requires local understanding of hydrology, cultural use, and ecological thresholds. Global awareness is necessary for political will, but local detail is necessary for outcomes. Wetlands are widespread, but each one is functionally specific. One of the most important services wetlands provide is water purification. As water moves slowly through wetland vegetation and soils, suspended particles settle out, and nutrients such as excess nitrogen and phosphorus can be captured, transformed, or stored. Plants absorb some nutrients directly. Microbial communities process others through redox-dependent pathways that are far less active in oxygen-rich systems. The practical impact is enormous, especially downstream. Cleaner water means lower treatment burdens, healthier fisheries, and reduced risk of eutrophication in lakes and coastal zones. Wetlands are not magical filters that can absorb infinite pollution, but they are high-performance natural infrastructure when protected and not overloaded. Their filtering capacity depends on intact hydrology, adequate retention time, and functioning plant microbe-soil interactions. If wetlands are drained, fragmented, or converted, those services decline and pollutant pulses move faster into rivers and coasts. So when wetlands are conserved, we are not just preserving habitat for wildlife, we are maintaining living treatment systems that support human water security at scales engineered systems alone often struggle to match. Wetlands also function as physical protection systems, stabilizing shorelines, buffering storms, and reducing flood impacts. Vegetation slows water velocity, roughens flow paths, and helps dissipate wave energy. In floodplain settings, inundation spreads across broad wet areas rather than concentrating destructive force in narrow channels. In coastal zones, mangrove-like wetlands can reduce erosion and limit inland penetration of storm surge by trapping sediment and building structural resistance over time. These mechanisms are especially important as climate extremes intensify. Gray infrastructure like seawalls and levees remains important, but relying on concrete alone often ignores the adaptive properties of ecosystems that grow, recover, and self-organize. Healthy wetlands can complement engineered defenses by lowering peak energy before it reaches built structures. They also provide co-benefits, habitat, carbon functions, and water quality gains that single-purpose infrastructure rarely offers. The strategic insight is not nature versus engineering, it is integrated risk reduction. Lose wetlands, and you lose one of the few defenses that protects people while simultaneously supporting ecological resilience. The climate story of wetlands is powerful but nuanced. Wetlands can serve as carbon sinks through carbon fixation and long-term storage in plant biomass and saturated soils. Because decomposition can be slower in oxygen-limited conditions, organic material may accumulate, effectively locking carbon away over long periods. This is one reason wetland conservation is increasingly discussed in climate mitigation frameworks. But there is a paradox. The same anaerobic conditions that preserve carbon can also produce methane through microbial decomposition pathways. Some wetlands may also emit nitrous oxide under certain nutrient and redox conditions. So wetlands are not automatically climate heroes in every metric at every moment. Their net climate role depends on wetland type, hydrologic regime, nutrient inputs, temperature, and disturbance history. Draining a wetland can release stored carbon rapidly, while restoring one may alter methane patterns before long-term storage benefits stabilize. The right conclusion is not simplistic optimism or pessimism. It is disciplined management. Protect existing high-value carbon stores, reduce damaging disturbances, and evaluate restoration pathways with full greenhouse gas accounting rather than one-number narratives. Despite their value, wetlands are heavily threatened by human activity. Extraction industries, infrastructure expansion, dredging, drainage, overgrazing, overfishing, nutrient pollution, and broader water contamination all degrade wetland function. Some pressures are direct, such as filling or channelizing wet areas for construction. Others are indirect, such as upstream land use that increases nutrient runoff or changes sediment loads. When wetlands are disconnected from their natural flood cycles, they may remain physically present on maps while ecologically collapsing in practice. Biodiversity declines, water quality buffering weakens, and hydrologic resilience drops. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment identified wetlands as among the most threatened ecosystem classes globally, and that warning remains relevant. The difficulty is that degradation can be incremental and therefore politically invisible. A wetland rarely vanishes overnight, it loses function in stages until the system crosses a threshold and recovery becomes expensive or impossible. Recognizing early warning signs, reduced seasonal flooding, invasive dominance, declining waterbird use, soil subsidence, is essential if conservation is to move from reaction to prevention. Conservation requires two things working together: measurement and governance. Ecological health assessments help quantify whether wetlands are functioning, not just whether they still exist spatially. Metrics can include hydrologic integrity, vegetation condition, nutrient status, species composition, and indicators of soil process stability. Good assessment frameworks also communicate value to the public and decision-makers by linking ecological condition to concrete outcomes like flood safety, fish productivity, and treatment cost avoidance. On the governance side, international cooperation has existed for decades through treaty-based identification and protection of wetlands considered globally important. But designation alone is not enough without local enforcement, financing, and integration into land and water planning. The most effective programs combine legal protection, basin-scale hydrologic management, restoration where feasible, and continuous monitoring that can trigger intervention before collapse. Wetland policy succeeds when it treats wetlands as essential infrastructure rather than optional scenery. If institutions plan that way, ecological and social returns compound over time. Restoration is possible, but it is not simple landscaping. Replanting vegetation without fixing hydrology often fails, because water regime drives everything else. Successful restoration usually starts by re-establishing flood connectivity, tidal exchange, or groundwater relationships, then supporting plant community recovery, controlling pollutant loads, and tracking long-term trajectories rather than expecting instant results. Some functions recover relatively quickly, such as certain habitat uses, while soil chemistry and carbon dynamics may take much longer. Trade-offs must be acknowledged openly, especially where climate goals intersect with methane behavior in newly re-wetted systems. Still, the alternative, permanent loss of wetland function, is usually more costly across generations. Communities that invest in restoration gain options: better flood buffering, improved water quality, biodiversity recovery, and climate-relevant carbon outcomes where conditions support them. The broader lesson is that wetland protection is easier than wetland reconstruction, but reconstruction is still worth pursuing when degradation has already occurred. In both cases, long-term stewardship matters more than one-time projects. If there is one takeaway, it is this: wetlands are not marginal spaces at the edge of rail systems. They are central systems that connect land, water, climate, and human security. They host extraordinary biodiversity, clean and regulate water, absorb environmental shocks, and participate in global carbon and greenhouse gas cycles in ways that demand precise understanding. Their complexity is exactly why they are valuable and why simplistic narratives fail. Protecting wetlands means respecting local hydrology, choosing land use with long-time horizons, and valuing ecosystem services before they disappear. For viewers, the practical shift is to stop seeing wetlands as empty space waiting for development and start seeing them as living infrastructure already doing difficult work every day. Once that perspective changes, policy choices become clearer. Conservation is no longer a niche environmental preference. It becomes a rational strategy for resilience, public safety, and ecological continuity in an increasingly uncertain century. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.